Okay, I'm doing an introduction to the Baroque period, but also to the periods that are most important in Western civilization leading up to the Baroque. Okay, so the first one on your sheet, and this is listed. It's called Lead Up and Intro to Baroque Age. It's uploaded to the content area, or will be by tonight. And you can follow along this sheet as you listen to this first part of the lecture. Okay. One of the reasons is to fill in the blank spaces that we've jumped over. And the other reason is to clarify the Baroque age, because the book does not do a real good job of explaining the Baroque age. Okay. So here we start. The very beginning is Adam and Eve. We don't know what they sang about or if they had instruments. It's just a joke. Okay, so that music is all lost. What we're going to really start with in Western civilization is classical Greece. And even the word classical, you can hear echoed in music. We talk about classical music in two ways. We talk about classical music as opposed to popular music. We talk about classical music as a particular era which uses the same ideas as classical Greece, as we're going to find out. The most recent of those classical ages was Mozart and Haydn, Vienna at the end of the 18th century. We'll come to that, I forget when, in the 6th or 8th week of class. But let's go back to classical Greece, from about 500 BC to about 400 BC, about 100 years, not very long time. But this was one of the most inspired and inspiring time periods in the world, certainly in Western civilization. All you have to do is drive down to Madison, and you're looking at classical Greece. The Capitol building in Madison is based on the idea of architecture of classical Greece, because the democracy we live in is based on the idea of classical Greece. So classical Greece is still very much with us, and you're going to hear it in the music a number of times. So the basic notion, and you're going to find that every time period seems to have an idea, a sense of values, a sense of common purpose, you might say, what you might call a worldview, that people more or less share. We do too, probably. We're not always aware of it, but we share certain assumptions about the world and about our culture and about our lives that we may not even be aware of. And it may be 100 years from now that people look back at us and say, in the 21st century, people used to feel this way about the world, and they'll explain it to us. We'll have to listen carefully. But now, classical Greece, the basic idea is, and that's the subtitle here, is an age of balance and harmony. And what does that mean? Throughout the history of the world, we've got ideas in our lives, in our societies, in our families, in our culture that are based on the relationship of opposites. Like the opposite of feeling would be what? What is the thing that, we have strong feelings, but sometimes we have to use the other side of our personality in order to keep them in perspective. What's the other part of the human spirit? Anyone want to take a gander?
Like logical?
Exactly, right on board. Yeah, very good. Yeah, because think about love, right? You fall in love, your feelings are overwhelmed. I can remember when I was 16, and she was just wonderful. She would have been the worst person for me. Logic could have told me that, but I was not listening to logic at all, right? On the other hand, you can be much too logical about love. I want somebody who earns something somewhere between such and such thousand and 17,000, has to be blonde, has to be da-da-da-dum, has to be da-da-dum, and because, the best possibility for my genes, that kind of logical approach to love is not also terribly wise, right? So the Greeks told us way back when, the best approach to a happy life, to a meaningful life, is to find a central balance between the opposites in our lives, and emotions and reason or logic is one of those balances. Alan Alda once gave a graduation speech to the what's it called, medical class, the graduating medical class at Harvard or Yale, I forget which, And his, you know, Alan Alda, right? He played the doctor on MASH in the Korean War, supposedly. And he said, you know, I'm not really a doctor, but I played one on TV, and I can give you some advice that only a non-doctor can give. He said the head bone is connected to the heart bone, and you got to keep them together. So, and that's kind of the classical Greek idea. Okay, now that goes throughout their society, and here I'm going to go down this list now. When they looked at religion and when they looked at science, they said, okay, we can find a middle ground here. We can say that the world is filled with some sort of spiritual presence. And they said that when they looked at the mystery of the world around them. But that they also believed in scientific explanations, cause and effect. And you can do both of those things. I think even in the modern world we sometimes get that confused, right? We think you have to either decide that God created the world or that it somehow happened by natural causes. Why not both, right? What the Greeks would have said. And that's a central balance, right? Also in human nature, and we talked about reason and emotion, you find a central balance. So that's what that second character means. All of these, many of the feelings, many of the things that we have inside us, the Greeks would have said, come from somewhere else. Reason, thinking, logic, even logic. We think, obviously, we can control it, but we didn't invent it. Love, we didn't invent love. We fall into it, so to speak. That's where that phrase comes from, right? It's something that's out there, and we participate in it. And they would have said that's all partly divine, not totally a new idea to Christianity, who Jesus said God is love, right? Same idea, exactly the same as the Greeks. They said divine, love is something divine, not human, but also human. And so love is both human and divine. And the early Christians would have believed that. We have to ask ourselves, do we still do that? Do we think of love as something divine and human, or do we just think of it as hormones, something biochemical that's happening in our brain? And it's been described that way. So all of that is a sense of a balance of opposites. Does that make sense? Now that idea of classical, this balance of opposites, the logical, the symmetrical on one hand, and the emotional and the asymmetrical and the longing on the other, the emotions, right? That balance comes up again with Mozart and Haydn. We're going to see it a little bit later in the music. And so hang on to this idea of classical Greece. And what you're looking at here is a depiction, for example, of power. Now, power is not visible, and it's not a naked man, right? Power is a force, right? Let the force be with you. That old idea from Star Wars is exactly what the Greeks were talking about. You can either use these things, power, or you can neglect them, but they're inside of you because they come from somewhere else. They're in nature, they're in the divine world, the spiritual world, and they're in us. And we can tap into them, or we cannot. Does that make sense? And that's why when you look at Zeus, the god of power, that's who that is, he looks like a naked man. Zeus did not look like a naked man. He wasn't human. He didn't have a shape or form. Even the Greeks would have said that. Zeus is a force. He's in us, he's in the lightning, he's in gravity, right? And there's nothing, no naked man standing here, right? But that's Zeus, right? And so this depiction of a naked man being Zeus is because he's in us, or it is in us too, right? Because the divine is in the human. That idea comes up. There's a wonderful line in Amadeus later on, in which one of the Italians is lecturing Mozart and says, the gods represent the eternal in us. Which is exactly what Mozart believed, by the way, but that's a different issue. So we'll come back to that. Right? So far, so good? That goes into other things as well, like democracy, where there's a balance between the individual rights and the rights of the society as a whole. The laws control us, individuals, because society needs that. But we can only have a law that does not infringe on our freedom because we as individuals need that. Right? That's why when you go into court, it's Martin Ulrich versus the state of Wisconsin. The state of Wisconsin is the group. Martin Ulrich is the individual. That versus, or that balance, justice is designed to find a balance. All that makes sense too. Now that balance between individual, or non-balance between individual and group, we're going to hear that today already in in some of the music we're going to hear in the Baroque period. But that balance in the Baroque period gets problematical, and we're going to see that in a bit. Okay, so far so good. That's classical Greece. In a nutshell, it's about harmony or balance of opposites, all kinds of them. So far so good, right? The music got lost, mostly. There are some fragments of music from classical Greece that are still around, but we really don't know that much about how it was played, how it sounds. We know about the instruments. That oboe that I brought last time, there was a kind of ancient Greek oboe 2,500 years ago, but it had two bores instead of the one that I had. I play like this, they played like this, but it had a double reed and it sounded kind of nasally like mine. Okay, on to the Roman Empire. The Romans were fascinated by the Greeks, but they thought they were kind of wimpy. You know, they didn't really know how to hold a great empire together. They weren't really geniuses at technology like the Romans were. They were geniuses, the Greeks, at philosophy and psychology and all those things. But the Romans weren't that interested in that sort of abstract thing. They were, I'm exaggerating a little, but they were technicians. They could bring water, fresh water, 50, 60, 80 miles from the mountains down into the cities. They could reroute the river Tiber to go into the Colosseum, apparently, and to one of the other stadiums to fill the thing with water so they could have naval battles in a stadium. Try that in Lambeau Field. I mean, they were brilliant at society building. So they were not classical in the classical Greek balance sense. So what I have here on your outline is science and technology is greater than, that's that algebra sign, right, than religion. They had their religion, but they really weren't very good at it, and they didn't often believe it, right? Society as a whole is more important than the individual. And they were kind of good at this for a while. They said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. John F. Kennedy, the great Roman emperor, said that. Sorry, that's a dumb joke. But what Kennedy was saying there, actually, in that speech was very Roman, kind of not very classical American in a way. Society is more important than the individual. Still with me? Okay, sorry if if you get overwhelmed there, just scream. I can slow down or stop for a moment. The law, which protects the group, is more important than freedom that protects the individual. The Romans weren't all that into individual freedom. They say, you do what your society asks of you. Like John F. Kennedy said, don't ask what your country can do for you. You got to do your duty to the country. The Romans were, in that sense, pretty one-sided. They created a great society, but it was built on the idea not of a classical balance, but of a non-classical non-balance. One thing is more important than the other, and you just got to do the right thing. Right? Does this make sense? And so, and that was reflected in their music too. Their music really was not great stuff. It was used as party music. It was used as military music. The trumpets were used in battle, as they were for years and centuries later too. But it was more of a practical thing for the Romans. Certain entertainment, of course, too. And they sang and danced, of course. But they were more interested in the function of society than they were in the enrichment of the soul, let's say. Okay? So the Romans were kind of a one-sided society. We were going to have to ask ourselves, what are we eventually when we get to that point? So that's the Roman period. Let's go on to the Middle Ages. As Rome fell, another force came up. It's about 300, 400, 500 AD after the death of Jesus, and that was the church. And that reflected not just the power of the church, but also the way most people in the Middle Ages for a long, long time thought, for almost 1,000 years really, is that the spiritual world, heaven, if you want to call it that, is more real, certainly more important, than the physical world. Now that's hard for us to buy. Right? We're not so sure sometimes whether the spiritual world is out there. The Middle Ages were absolutely sure of that. They weren't so sure that the physical world was here. I'm exaggerating. But they really firmly believed that this life you and I are sitting in right now, this three-dimensional world, is really just a flash in the pan. And it's really more of a preparation for something that's going to be much more powerful. Now, we can believe that, but it takes a stretch, and it was no stretch for the Middle Ages. Does that make sense? So it's an imbalance, like the Romans, it's an imbalance, and it's not classical. But it's an imbalance in the other direction. The Romans were about the physical world, about the technical world, about creating a great society. The Middle Ages did some of that, not very well. But what they were really interested in was the spiritual dimension. And they developed beautiful artworks, Gothic cathedrals that blow you away. Go to Germany sometime and go into the Cologne Cathedral. It's unbelievable what faith can do if you really believe it's much more important than... Because when you walk into this thing, you are walking into an extra-dimensional space. The light through the stained glass window must have blown people away because the light, you don't see that kind of light in the real, so to speak, world. It's only in the spiritual space, the imaginary heaven of the inside of the cathedral. Right? Also, the biggest building they had ever seen is about as tall as this room. And then they walk into Cologne and they see this thing, which is, I'm not exactly sure how tall it is, but it's, hand that the directions to an architect today in the 21st century, they'll say, you're nuts. Without steel, you can't build that thing. Of course, they know better. But make sense? Mm-hmm. So it was a great age, but it was a one-sided age in the other direction. So far, so good? Mm-hmm. The music was beautiful. And one of the interesting things about Gregorian chant, for example, is that it has no beat. Thump, 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 right? There is no thump. It floats. You watch it. You can feel it. It just kind of floats without a drum beat, which means all of these rhythms that we have in our heartbeat, in our walking, in the days and nights of our lives, in the breathing in and the breathing out, in the blinking of our eyes, right? Everything that attaches us to this physical world seemed to be swept away in those chants. And we just floated above all of this, just like we floated above all of this when we walked into the Gothic cathedral. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's another period that we're skipping, alas, this beautiful time period. But that music, as beautiful as it is also not so common in this age anymore. So we're going to let it be because we have to make some cuts, alas. It's in the book, and you're welcome to go back, obviously, and take a look because there's some gorgeous stuff. The Middle Ages started changing again around 1400 into a new age, and we call that the Renaissance. Okay, so the Renaissance, another beautiful age in many, many ways, was another classical age. The Renaissance rediscovered the Greeks, the classical Greeks, and said, this, as nice as heaven may be, I like to think of the world as a balance, as a harmony between that spiritual stuff, whatever that is, and this physical stuff, which is down here. So they rediscovered the nude, for example, which had been gone for, 1,000 years. Nobody did sculptures of naked humans. Because what for? The physical body is meaningless, right? I mean, it's really about something spiritual. It said the Middle Ages. Now the Renaissance said, no. A physical human being is also a spiritual human being. We have, just like the Greeks said. And that harmony, that coming together of two things, is what we want to think about, what we want to remind ourselves of. And that's what their culture was about, that's what their sculpture was about. So all of a sudden you get sculptures that look like this again. Think of Michelangelo's David, that one in Florence, the naked David, who is not Jesus anymore, not an angel, not even all that important a spiritual figure in the Bible, just a guy, a king of Israel, an important king, right? But give me a break. I mean, he's just a king. Makes sense? But for the Renaissance, they would have said, no, this is you and me. This is us. This is us in our nakedness with this power of concentration and focus and the beauty of the body and all those things that make us spiritual and physical at the same time. And the music is some of the most spectacularly gorgeous choral stuff with these moving parts like this. And all of a sudden these parts, what we call polyphony, here's that word, that we kind of skipped last week. Oh, hello. I think that was, did you get that? That was good. I'm just going to check if my computer's still alive. Yes, it's still alive. All right. Polyphony means different voices singing different things or the same things at different times, right? And we're going to hear a lot of that also today in the Baroque period. But this polyphony, on the one hand, means it's not all this one voice, this single-minded floating above the world, but it's all these individual voices like you and me in the world, right? The multitude of human voices. At the same time, it does seem to still float like a chant. So it does both. It creates an interchange of voices like the physical world is an interchange of people and forces and ideas. But it also keeps this sense of spirituality, that this timeless, almost a sense of lack of a beat. Actually, there is a beat there, but you really don't feel it in most sacred choral music of the Renaissance. Okay, that's up to there. Why don't we cut it for a moment?